Hello, today I'm going to be looking at Tekken 5, which is the sixth main instalment of the Tekken series, if we take into account Tekken Tag Tournament, and perhaps personally one of my favourite games in the entire Tekken franchise, truth be told. That said, I'm going to try and be objective about it, as I have been with all games thus far, and in terms of narrative, I won't get into this too much now, I'm digressing slightly already, but in terms of narrative, I did start to get lost around here. So, where in Tekken's 1, 2, and 3, less so in Tekken 4, I was talking about characters in depth, I was talking about, storyline in depth, which is something that I personally invest myself in with the games. Tekken 5 did sort of lose me around here in terms of its story. It got quite convoluted, we're still having Mishimas and Kazamas being introduced, a myriad of new characters being introduced for whatever reason. But that being said, I still feel that this is a fantastic game that stands up really well today. It did come out in 2004 in Japan, 2005. So yeah, we're looking at a game that came out pretty much 10 years ago. And yeah, kind of starting it up here, I think it's still as playable today as it was when it first came out in arcades and on consoles back in 2005. Now, before I get into the review proper, I just want to apologise, or at least kind of mention, when I started doing these reviews, and especially these History of Tekken series, which were meant to be quite consistent, following one another, I did intend to kind of publish one a week or something like that. I've actually been quite sidetracked with doing other things. I'm actually in the process of writing a thesis on gameology or history of video games, whatever you want to call it. I'm actually quite ardently a supporter of positing video games as an artistic medium. As such, a lot of my time has been invested in this. I'm also looking at writing up about video game scores. I'm doing a piece on Yumatsu, of course, who've done the Final Fantasy series. So, quite a lot of stuff to this end, and unfortunately, my history series has fallen by the wayside a bit. Now, one of the things that really stands out and strikes me with Tekken 5, and this in a lot of ways is similar to Tekken Tag Tournament, but I think for a different reason as well. Tekken Tag Tournament was a sort of gleeful nod and a celebration of the first three Tekken games, as I said in that discussion, in that discourse, where they brought together all the characters from the first three Tekken games in this non-canon sort of installment. And it was very celebratory and very, a kind of send-off for the first generation of a console, the PlayStation 1 that the first three Tekken games were on. Now, Tekken 5, in a lot of ways, is similarly a celebration of Tekken. And the reason I feel that they've done this is, objectively speaking, and I spoke about this in Tekken 4, is that Tekken 4 wasn't a very Tekken game. It wasn't a very well-received game as by the hardcore fans of Tekken. So I feel with Tekken 5 they really kind of went above and beyond, and they really sought to introduce elements that were very classically Tekken. An example of this, a prime example, in fact, is when you start up the game, you have the little Space Invaders game. There's a little Space Invaders game that you get, which we haven't actually seen since the first Tekken game. So it's sort of like a gleeful nod in that direction. Secondly, the introductory animation itself is absolutely fantastic, and we haven't seen anything this action-packed and this encouraging, to start up the game since Tekken 3, where we have the scene of Heihachi landing in New Mexico at the beginning of Tekken 3. Tekken 5 has that sort of intro that really throws you into the action. It really kind of gears you up for, the fighting game that you're about to play, and we have Heihachi and Kazuya in this fight scene at the beginning before we get introduced to a montage of all the characters, and it's absolutely brilliant. I actually think this is I find it's really hard to believe this is in fact a PlayStation 2 game. This opening is in fact on a par with the PS3, I would say personally, and that's how much effort that was put into this opening. And it sounds like I'm kind of giving it so much praise and things like that, but if you in fact go back, if you in fact just type in on YouTube Tekken 4 opening video, you can see how that was so bad. It was such a letdown after Tekken 3. So and if you go ahead and watch Tekken 4, then go ahead and watch the Tekken 5 opening FMV, it's just light years ahead. It's just absolutely brilliant, and it's a really encouraging thing you know, for these fans to have seen, you know, following the relative letdown that was Tekken 4. So in terms of the characters, which I will cover briefly, in fact I'm only going to cover a couple of the characters because, you know, as I said before, I keep getting lost with all the storylines and things like that are introduced. But the ones that personally really stand out for me, and you will notice them straight away in the opening, is Fei Wong is awesome. And, you know, if we're going to go with the whole argument that Tekken likes to have nods to martial arts, you know, heroes, you know, Fei Wong, you know, we could posit him as a Jet Li in Once Upon a Time in China, I suppose. But Jet Li in that film is actually, you know, a really nice kind of Shaolin monk. Fei Wong is in fact inherently an evil bastard, and he has a very generic storyline, which is the fact, you know, he kills his master and he's trying to kind of seek power and become, you know, the best martial artist in the world. But in that, you know, aesthetically and how he handles gameplay wise, you know, Fei Wong is in fact a really awesome and original character. I really like him a lot, and I think he's in fact an asset to the Tekken franchise. Another new character who we see, in fact, even earlier in the opening FMV, we see him almost straight away, in fact, is Raven. I keep almost calling him Blade because, again, we sort of have this pop culture reference. I think it's impossible that Raven is not, at least to some degree, you know, inspired by the character of Blade. The whole kind of sunglasses, you know, sort of assassin attire with all the blades and everything. You know, I think he's definitely a kind of pop culture reference here as well, along with, of course, you know, we have Forrest Law returning, who's like Bruce Lee, and Lei Wulong, who is of course an early Jackie Chan. Other new characters include Asuka Kazama. I suppose we could say she's sort of an important character, but only because she's somehow related to Jin. I think they're in fact cousins. I never really play as Asuka much. The only thing I really like about her is she inherits some of Jun Kazama's old, you know, fighting techniques, and I really liked Jun. Jinpachi, you know, I suppose we can spend a little bit more time discussing him because he is the main antagonist. I think I in fact quite like that Amishima became an antagonist once again, and they kept it fresh by it not being Heihachi. But having said that, you know, a kind of granddad who has been locked up underneath, you know, layers of concrete for years and stuff, it's getting a bit silly, and we've got the whole Mishima bloodline devil gene thing going on, and, you know, it's getting a bit weird for me. Also, Jinpachi is a bastard to be on normal mode above. Even on easy mode, you know, he can be quite challenging if you're not, you know, fully competent with your character. So when you're playing through, you know, trying to get all the ending animations, it's really quite annoying. As I've said before, if I need to repeat a stage, you know, more than 5 times, I start getting really annoyed. And Jinpachi was one of those, you know, where he can in fact shoot weird lasers out of his stomach and things like that. I just found it really quite irritating, you know, when I was doing it in normal mode, hard mode, things like that. Even with Paul Phoenix, you know, who is my you know, primary character that I play. Yeah, he was a bit of a challenge. A few innovations, and I've mentioned this before. I mentioned this in fact right off the bat in Tekken 1, and it is a sort of defence that I have for the Tekken series. You know, when we had cock-ups such as Tekken 4, a defence for the developers of Tekken were, in fact, that they like pushing boundaries. They're not scared to push boundaries, and they like trying new things to see how they come up with fans and how, in fact, you know, they just play out as video games. So there's something about that that is quite endearing. In fact, it's like, you know, they aren't this massive corporation that are trying to, you know, make loads of money, which of course, you know, there is that element, and it is Namco who are massive, but the fact they're not afraid to take risks, I think, you know, they do want the user experience to be innovative and, you know, enjoyable. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with things like Tekken 4, but, you know, with Tekken 5 we do have slight additions. So, like its predecessors, Tekken 5 does bring to the table a few of its own innovations and a few little, you know, kind of additions that we haven't seen in previous games. I think perhaps the most obvious, the one that stands out the most is the omission of Tekken Force Mode, which has been a a staple since, you know, Tekken 3, and it was repeated again in Tekken 4. They opted against this and they went for the Devil Within mini game, which starred Jin, and it was more like a. It's difficult. In fact, it's more because where Tekken Force was like, you know, harkening back to these Streets of Rage kind of 2D beat 'em up games. The Devil Within is similar to that, but in fact it's more. You know, in fact, I cannot think of a game that the Devil Within reminds me of. It's kind of like, you know, you're running around GTA style. It's kind of like, you know, over the, you know, from behind the character over the shoulder sort of view, and you're running around, and it's like a puzzle game and an action game. Personally, I found it got a bit drawn out, you know, trying to get to the end of it. In fact, I do not think to this day I've actually completed the Devil Within. I've got very close, you know, I'm right, you know, towards the end of the stages, but it got a bit repetitive and I got a bit lost, and, you know, it's very maze-like, and I just found the small, consistent, self-contained nature of Tekken Force mode played out a lot better than what we saw in the Devil Within. Tekken 6, again, you know, digressing slightly, took the Tekken Force element a lot further, I think, and, you know, the main gameplay aspect, in fact, of Tekken 6 became Tekken Force, which I'll talk about next time, but I think that really split decision, actually. But, sorry, running away with myself. So, yeah, the Devil Within was one of the leap of faiths, I suppose, that the Tekken development team took. And even though it was an add-on, so it didn't really kind of affect the main gameplay, you know, the inherent dynamic of Tekken, which is to be a one-on-one beat-em-up, it was still radical enough to get a reaction from me, I suppose, and, you know, I know other people that, you know, don't like that very much. But then again, you know, I'm sure there's people out there that, you know, really like the Devil Within, and I'm ultimately, you know, I'm neither here nor there about it. As I said at the beginning, you know, Tekken 5 is one of my favourite Tekken games, and the Devil Within minigame doesn't do much to, you know, it's not much of a detriment for me, in fact, because it's such a small aspect of the game. Another small tweak, which is quite odd, and I think if they introduced this earlier in the series, it would have been more, I don't know, I can't say well received, but, you know, more of a thing, really. That's all I can say, more of a thing. But that is that you can actually customise your character's costumes, so, you know, you can get these little additions and things like that to add on to your characters. In Tekken 6, again, digressing slightly, this became a much more relevant thing because they actually alter your stats, so how you perform in the, you know, run around beat 'em up mode. In Tekken 5, I think it's more for solely aesthetic purposes, so, you know, for example, you can customise Paul Phoenix to have, you know, sunglasses or a hat or a jacket or something like that, and there's various options like that for each character. Now, on a personal level, I'm neither here nor there about it. I don't really care for this, which is odd because I really like customization in games. I love games like Skyrim, you know, where you can design your own character and you can dress them up in, you know, certain armour and things like that. I like having a uniqueness of character, and I love customization in games. However, with the Tekken series, which is such a staple of video game history, and it's such a well-renowned franchise with such a well-renowned cast of characters, I actually think it's a detriment to kind of, you know, dress them up and kind of bastardize them in a sense. You know, I always picture Paul Phoenix with the red judo uniform. I always picture Yoshimitsu, you know, however he's been created for that game, you know, with a crazy mask. And I always picture Kazuya in either, you know, the kind of white trousers and shirtless, or in a suit. You know, that's how I picture, you know, my Tekken characters. I don't want to kind of dress them up in these silly, you know, accessories and things like that, because I feel it kind of cheapens the experience in a lot of ways. I wasn't as concerned about it with Tekken 6 because it was, you know, necessary in a sense to make them look stupid, to make them perform better as characters. But again, you know, it's something I'm neither here nor there about, and it's not something that I ever personally utilise when I play Tekken 5. Moving on to one of the final little additions that I in fact really personally love in Tekken 5, and I'm sure a lot of the perhaps more old school fans, you know, love this about Tekken 5 as well, and it's almost an apology for Tekken 4 because it's actually omitted from this, but they have an arcade history mode, and this is great because you know, just speaking, you know, my personal discovery of this and, you know, a personal kind of recollection of playing arcade mode, I had actually lost Tekken 1, my Tekken 1 PlayStation 1 disc, for a number of years. In fact, I did not get it until probably about a year before I started doing this series. I decided to buy it on eBay again. But anyway, you know, regardless, this arcade history mode that was available on Tekken 5, it allows you to play, of course, like it says, it allows you to play the arcade modes of the first 3 Tekken games, and that really is fun, and it really is a brilliant spectacle, in fact, to see how far the series has come. You know, playing Tekken 1, the recovery time, god damn, I mean, it's so long, as I discussed it in my first Tekken video, you know, but it's still endearing, and it's still, you know, really great to play through, and it was really nice. And it goes back to what I was saying about in the beginning, in fact, where Tekken 5 is sort of like a gleeful nod towards earlier Tekken games, the first 3 Tekken games, and almost, you know, a kind of apology for Tekken 4 in a lot of ways. You know, we have the Space Invaders, we have the great intro that kind of harkens back to Tekken 3, and, you know, we have this fantastic celebratory little additional mode that, you know, allows us to play these old games that, you know, we kind of, you know, we loved playing. And I'm sure there was a new generation of Tekken fans that, you know, Tekken 5 was perhaps their first venture into the series, but, you know, I think for new fans and old fans alike, that would have been an enjoyable thing to play, you know, just to see, you know, the kind of history and how far this franchise has moved forward. Moving on finally to the music and stages, and I always kind of cover this last. Tekken 5 has some beautifully rendered stages. You know, they are brilliant backgrounds, and I really do like them. They really do stand out for me. They don't have the same nostalgia as, for example, Tekken 3 stages do or Tekken 2 stages do. Regardless of this, they are, you know, brilliantly done. As I've said before, Tekken 5, I don't know how they done it, but it seems to me on a par with PlayStation 3 graphics. Moonlit Wilderness, as one example, is, you know, as it's described, is kind of, you know, you have a big full moon in the background, you have these clouds, you have a derelict, burnt out castle by the looks of it in the background, but the foreground you have this field and these flowers kind of undulating and blowing in the wind as you're fighting, and, you know, it's so well done. I just, you know, it's actually brilliant. Urban Jungle is another stage that is quite humorous for me, because it's like, you know, a kind of underground fighting ring. You have characters in the background kind of shouting and egging you on, and this is something, you know, they started introducing kind of little additions in the backgrounds in Tekken 4, but not on this scale. You know, there's a transit van kind of suspended from a rope and swinging in the background of the Urban Jungle stage, you know, and it's really quite amusing, and it's really it really adds to the sense that the environment is inhabited and that it's populated and that, you know, it exists. It's on a kind of inhabited plane, as opposed to just this sort of derelict, sort of out of time space context. You know, it's actually given a lot more grounding in reality and a lot more context, which, you know, of course Tekken always strives to do in a lot of ways, which is brilliant. You know, they all have this sort of uniqueness to them, and this, you know, this wonderfully rendered, wonderfully done, and wonderfully original as well. They all kind of divorce themselves from what we've seen in Tekken before, but in a good way. You know, they don't necessarily need to hold to the tradition that Tekken has done with stages. In fact, in every Tekken game, the stages are radically different from one another. So, you know, in fact, it is sort of an ongoing thing that, you know, the only thing that's really different, you know, where we have a cast of characters that is inherently, you know, the same and is just built upon, you know, we have the stages that radically change, so that, you know, there is a degree of uniqueness and innovation to every new game. In terms of music, I said before, and I've said this, you know, through each video, the first 3 Tekken games for me was the epitome of the Tekken soundtrack. Tekken 2 and 3 in particular, I absolutely love those soundtracks. I listen to them on my MP3 player. They're that good. I can listen to them all day, you know, and, you know, I go around my daily business and I can, you know, they come up on, you know, random or whatever. Tekken 5 and other Tekken installments, they don't have bad soundtracks, any extent of the imagination. They are, in fact, very good soundtracks, but they are just not, for me, on a par with what we've previously seen in the series, particularly the first 3 games. The music for Tekken 5, it just doesn't have that unique character. There's no one track that stands out for me, where in previous games, I've had, Ring a Bell, for example, Tekken 2, it's amazing, As Bald As for Tekken 2, again, amazing, Acropolis Zone for Tekken 1, amazing, I can name those tracks and they can instantly come into my head, and they have that kind of unique character to them. Tekken 5 isn't like that. It's sort of just like 12 tracks. It's just like a one big mash of sound that I couldn't tally one with any one stage or anything like that. But yeah, perhaps I'm being a little bit too unfair. They work well for the game, and that's great. Tekken 5 is one of the best Tekken games in my opinion, and I feel it harkens back to the glory days, if you like, of Tekken 3 especially, and Tekken 2. It has that sort of character to it, has that uniqueness to it graphically, and it has a very distinct energy to it that I feel was lacking in Tekken 4. In terms of graphics, it's very fluid, it's very smooth, it works more like Tekken 3, I would say, than Tekken 4, which was quite slow, quite cumbersome, had a very, cumbersome sidestep system, and it just wasn't very enjoyable to play personally. The responsiveness of Tekken 5 is absolutely brilliant. The embellishments on the movesets and the new abilities that the characters have is absolutely fantastic. And when it comes down to it, these Tekken games are all about the quality of the character and gameplay, how they work in game. So everything I've discussed thus far is what distinguishes Tekken from its predecessors. But one of perhaps the most integral aspect is this gameplay, and it works really well. I haven't had this much enjoyment, playing a Tekken game since I first played Tekken 3 back in the day. So it really was great to get back into Tekken with this instalment. So yeah, that about sums it up for what I have to say about Tekken 5. All in all, it's a fantastic game.